It was my birthday a couple of weeks ago, so I feel really, really, like, annoyed. so if we just rewind a little bit, like a couple of weeks ago, my age was 42. And I was just getting used to that. And I have been much younger before that. Cindy made this big song dance, I'm not sure if you caught her, but like really important thing about kind of stating your age and being open and presenting and representing. That's what it really is. Because when we represent, we make things more normal. It becomes more normal to understand that people of all ages are quite comfortable on a stage like this, presenting insights and hopefully really interesting presentations. And then we go away and we know that we can do that. Anyone can do that. It doesn't matter. So this is kind of like this whole talk in a nutshell, summed up by the fact that I actually do have some issues about being 43. I don't need to explain the title. I'll start by talking about what I do. What I do is, well, I talk a lot, and I write little bits and pieces, and I do what I call kind of creative fairy dust for Google, and have done for a really long time. And I represent. So I do queer stuff, LGBT stuff. And today's talk is a little bit more about that sort of stuff. Funnily enough, it's actually mainly about this line. I know, thrilling. So don't get super excited, but mainly what I want you to take away at the end is that blue line. And hopefully it will mean something more to you by then. But before we start, we have to talk about me, because I'm here, and I thought I'd show a picture of me. This is me, both of me. I know, it's funny, right? It looks almost glamorous. And I wish I could say that that was an accurate portrayal of transition for a trans person. Obviously it's not. That data that you've got there, that's flawed data. Sort of true in a Giuliani kind of way. But my transition was more like this. I started at Google in 2006. I was a contractor, and then they hired me, which made me very happy, and then I ate all the food, and a teeny tiny bit of weight, and then I changed my name, which was weird and complicated, and then I had the kind of security photo that everybody dreads, and you know, now I'm kind of more or less somewhere happier, but this still isn't accurate. This is not an accurate representation of my transition. This gives sort of well, you've got 6 data points, and well, 12 if we're going to include the name. But there are holes in both those data sets, and the information is not complete, and it matters because of a graph, because of like that line that we just showed you. So just in case you wanted questions for later, these are 2 questions that I'm not going to answer. Mainly because there's not really a satisfactory explanation for them. But there are lots of explanations. There's another thing about this talk, which is that it is about the fact that you can see things from lots of different perspectives. There are lots of different intersections, and it is really important to understand the nuance of anything. But none of this is that straightforward. I do stuff. I have worked on projects for Google's Creative Lab for the last 10 years. So that has meant things like we did a film with Ridley Scott called Life in a Day. We did a project with the British Science Museum in London called Web Lab. We took an orchestra that we auditioned online using this actually very new platform called YouTube, and then took to Carnegie Hall, and then later on we took them to the Sydney Opera House. We did a play with the Royal Shakespeare Company. We've made some books, which I will actually talk about. All sorts of fun things. But it's very difficult for me to talk about this because I always really struggle with this idea that, like, I call myself a designer, and I'm not really a designer. I don't know if you guys are designers or creatives, or if you struggle with that word, or whether you're account people or media people. I don't know. Maybe we can chat later. But I do this mainly. I kind of draw things on whiteboards and then expect everybody to understand exactly what I'm talking about. It's like, here you go. This is an actual project. We haven't quite finished it yet. I'm not sure whether we're going to start it, but it's every now and again when I'm doing this talk, I go, we really should do this. Because to me, that's a whole project. It now exists. And in order for it to really exist, what I need are these extraordinary people, and I had to bring lots of different types of people together, because one of the most complicated parts is trying to put people who speak in one form next to people who speak in another form, and then expecting them to completely communicate fluently with one another. I also basically just surround myself with those kinds of people. I surround myself with developers and designers and artists and illustrators and filmmakers and dancers and philosophers. And the world is very much opened up when you surround yourself with people who don't actually see the world the same way that you do. One of the things that you can't do is you can't just tell them all what to do. You can't do that. That's not going to work. It's how we work. You have like ECDs, and they tell the CDs, and they tell the ADs, and then the ADs just shout. That's pretty much how our agency world works at the moment, as far as I understand it. And everyone gets stressed and works really late. And then it goes back with more shouting. Certainly there's this model which is like you have a creative director or a kind of like normally an old white guy, frankly, at the top who is conducting, pulling strings, however you want to do it. It's very much kind of like someone is in charge, they are leading us, they're taking us, they have a vision, this is where we're going. I prefer more of a gardening approach, where you get the pretty flowers, you find the garden, you put them in the garden next to each other, occasionally you move them about a bit, but basically then you just water them and talk to them. And then they grow, and they bloom, and they blossom. And then they are very beautiful. And then people come along and go, what a beautiful garden. And you say, thank you, it's all my own work. I like to talk about creativity and innovation and inclusion, and I may even have put all of those in the title, but really, because of the nature of today, we're going to talk about a culture of inclusion. Like, that is a culture way forward. That is about creating spaces in which people can optimize themselves, rather than being creativity, or being innovative, or being inclusive. If you don't have a culture of inclusion, being inclusive means nothing. It's completely irrelevant. We do these things that we have already talked about on this stage. We as society, we create visibility for marginalised voices. At Google, we run conscious bias workshops. In Life, we promote free discourse. Progressives try to push for legislation that treats everyone equally. Ideally, we try and encourage value sets that don't disparage or diminish anyone's lived experience. We all try to be better people. But quite often that comes back to like Instagram. Did everyone come to Liz's talk? She just gave this talk. It's like, I probably should have taken the slide out, but I didn't realise that I would be talking straight after her. But one of the funniest things is that when you scratch at how that is working, you realise that when we have like, I think it's a, not a pronoun, what is it, an adverb? What's with? Yes, great. Like, when we look for those words, you suddenly realise how unimportant they are. Because we search for design with disability and we get for disability, the whole way down. And that was absolutely mind-blowing to me when Liz Jackson, who was just speaking, kind of brought it to my attention. And so it's been wonderful to be part of this thing, and it's also been wonderful to see that grow from being just someone being really cross to an actual program. But it's grassroots up. This is things that start with people being really cross. If you were watching Katrina's presentation earlier from Contagious, you will have seen the slide for the pedigree chum thing. Now, in there was a Kiwi called Tara, who was the one sort of doing the geeky stuff about the animal faces. She doesn't understand what she's talking about, which is quite funny. But the most important part is that actually I want to talk about her again. She's now got 2 points. Tara McEntee, go check her out. Because she has definitely got really cross about how there weren't any programs set up that were literally bringing and training and building up marginalised voices. So they set up a thing called RARE. They got it together with D&AD. They ran one in Sydney. They're now running them all around the world. They're like 3-day workshops. Works with Berlin School. It's very much like a training program. It's like a 3-day MBA. It's really hardcore. 2 girls. The future is ND. The future is neurodiverse. We're not going to deep dive into what neurodiverse means or neurodiversity. Quick show of hands. Does everyone know what neurodiversity is? Or maybe a shallow dive into neurodiversity then. The lazy way to describe neurodiversity is that it's kind of a more palatable umbrella term for neurological disorders like autism or autism spectrum disorder. But along with those, you have other neurological considerations like, why can I only think of mine? Prosopagnosia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, things which are ADHD, ADD. Actually, we will talk a little bit about it, because I want to talk a little bit about those kind of things. But when we talk about it as a form of different way of thinking, we can bring those people together, and you can create an umbrella around which they can talk. And what was super frustrating for us was that we were going to women's conferences, actually, and listening to men and women with no neurodiverse kind of, who managed people who are neurodiverse, or who had family who are neurodiverse. And you're there going, if this was like the women's conference and it was all guys talking about people they managed who were female, or their wives or their daughters who were female, and what creativity meant to them, it would be very, very frustrating. So this is a woman called Lucy Hobbs in London who has initiated and started this whole thing. It is really very grassroots. Here's a list. They're all grassroots. They're all people getting angry and starting things on their own because nothing else is happening. There is nothing coming down. The main reason you need to understand why that phenomenon is happening is because of this fascinating chart. This is a distribution graph. I don't really know very much about statistics, but look, it's got an axis, and you can also draw it as a curve, and this is called a distribution curve or a bell curve because it looks like a bell. And that's literally all I know. For me, this curve describes privilege. And privilege, as I said at the start, exists in different ways for every aspect of your identity. Within any culture, there's a curve of normal behaviour, and that's often centred around social consensus. Anytime you notice yourself adapting your behaviour, your accent, you're hiding your sexuality, or changing your clothes in order to get closer or even further from the middle of that curve, you are noticing your difference. That's what's happening. And you can't have difference without a normal, without a normative centre. And rather than celebrating difference, we often stigmatise it, right? We often call it radical, which is kind of positive, or edgy, or queer, or weird. And what's most strange to me is that we use the word abnormal and normal, when what we're really talking about is common and uncommon. Right? With me? Typical, less typical. And where that goes to very clearly is included and excluded. We stigmatise the excluded because there's privilege for those nearest the middle. And increasing disparity for those near the edges, at the margins, people we call marginalised. So this curve, straight up, is a really useful way to think of the idea of inclusion. You've got your normal and you've got your other. But the problem is, no one's normal. Really. The least normal person you know is someone who's completely normal. So we're all queer and other and excluded. And probably the only factor that we share is empathy towards the fact of being excluded. And if you're there going, no, actually, I'm really normal, guess what? One day you'll be old. We are beginning to tackle this in different ways. This is actually quite old chart. So Google and the other tech companies have been under spotlight on this sort of stuff for a long time. It is not good. This is quite old. It's still not good. First of all, we're just going on kind of like this very, very simple notion of there's a gender bias and there's a racial bias, which is very dominant actually in North America. And I think one of the wonderful things about today is like this, there is a lot of other intersection. But that's old data, so here's slightly newer data, and it's still not good. We're working really hard at it, but it's still not good. So why on earth would I put up 2 slides saying we're working hard, but it's still not good? Because we're working harder than you guys. There's just, I mean, like I was talking to Scott about this, it's like trying to find data for representation. There may be transparency reports in your organisation. If they are, they're not very transparent. There may be kind of industry-wide initiatives, but quite often they're about the initiative, not about the problem. And until we understand the problem, it's very, very difficult to deal with the solution. So here's an initiative that opened this up to me, I loved. So I was part of See It Be It at Cannes with Madonna and Chloe Gottlieb, who's like who ran this thing. And we met these amazing, amazing, amazing girls from all over the world. Women. I just always feel really old. That's the problem. I spend my life feeling old now, and it's so funny listening to Cindy go, there's nothing wrong with that. That's cool. It's not going to get better. The best bit about not the best, but one of the most intense experiences as part of this, it brings 20 young women from creative industries around the world together for a week of kind of behind the scenes intensive learning at the Cannes Festival. And on the Wednesday or the Thursday, we had this dinner party, which was a no-holds-barred emotion fest. Like everything was revealed. Like everyone told all of their stories, because by that point they'd been like just living together for 4 days, and it was super intense. It was like I felt like everything had been left on the floor. It was definitely the most emotional dinner party I've ever been to. 2 weeks later on WhatsApp, because of course there's a WhatsApp group, this conversation starts. Funnily enough, Dennis, who's one of those kind of like slightly intense, difficult people, you're like, okay, I'm gonna move down the table now, Dennis. She starts to talk about this. You don't need to read this, it's just she that is a conversation. This is Dennis. She's fab, but she's a little bit of a handful. And she comes out as being ADD. And it's like, of course you are. Now, why didn't you mention that? We shared everything. Everything. Why did that not come up? And then another girl's like, oh, I'm ADHD. It's like, well, why didn't you mention that? And they're like, why didn't you mention that you had mental health problems? And it's like, because I'm meant to be in charge. It's so hard to share that. They still keep it, like they're still in the closet in their agencies. I don't think this is helping. I don't know, maybe I'll get to Turkey and give it one day. I'm sure she wouldn't mind. I'd bring her up on stage. She would completely steal the stage and the show. She's amazing, but it's very, very hard to say, yeah, you're a genius, and the reason that you are so talented and the reason you're so brilliant is something that will probably get you totally isolated if you really shared it. And we knew that, even on WhatsApp, even going back and forth about it. So the thing to do, the most important part, it's just like sharing my age, is to normalize all this stuff. She's had a point. It's like, why didn't you represent? Why didn't you disclose? So this is so much fun. But here's my disclosures. Like, I'm 43. I also have weird blood thing, which means I don't drink, it's terribly boring. From that neurodiversity point, I have gender dysphoria, which is kind of evident now, but that's a neurological disorder that occurs in the womb during birth. It's not like something you choose. and prosopagnosia, which is face blindness, which is kind of comedy, but also massively life-changing. It's like, I cannot convince people that even if I've known them for 20 years, I still have to work out who they are. I have psychological disorders, mental health problems, like complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and dissociative disorders. And CPTSD is, well, it's basically very like PTSD, it's just more complicated. My sexuality, not that I'm looking for a date or anything, but I'm bisexual, and that took a really long time to work out as well. And then I thought, well, I better stick down some privileges as well, right? So, like, I'm white, I'm well educated, I'm well paid. Really things you don't think about, like I'm able and I'm straight-sized, which are big pluses in this world that we live in. I have a loving partner. She's a bit cross at me at the moment, but she does love me. I have family, I have friends, I have a support network. As a bonus, I have generalised anxiety, but I think that's like when you get a free wash bag when you spend $100 down the chemist thing. You know, of course I've got generalised anxiety. Now, why on earth would I want to tell you all of that? Well, it makes no fucking difference. I'm still really good at my job. I'm really good at my job, and none of that has anything to do with it. It just doesn't mean anything. This curve that we have is a normative curve. Like, we pile so much into it, and we do go towards it. It's why cinnamon buns taste the same in every Starbucks all around the world. It's why music sounds the same. It's why all these talks sound the same. Like, we understand things. It's why so much is the same, because being normal removes a lot of cognitive effort. And that makes us feel safer. And to an extent, that is driven by kind of globalization and free trade. And there's a reason it's financially effective. And it is effective because we need this bell curve of normativity to feel safe. We don't use the bell curve. It's not like it's set in stone. There isn't a normal. We don't use it to enforce morality or standards or gender roles. It's not a tool. We create it. We create a curve of what is normal. And then we teach it to our systems, both for efficiency and security. Which and like the big one of those, obviously, is machine learning. Right? Machine learning uses recursive pattern recognition to answer questions. Quick handshake again. Who's down with machine learning and understands if I start just rabbiting on about it? Okay, that's more, but shallow dive into machine learning. It's not magic, and it's not conscious. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we're not talking about intelligence. We're talking about pattern recognition, often by setting up big databases of data which can then interrogate each other. But they have to exist, right? Even when it is creating new things, it is creating new things out of old things that it has acquired, learned by comparing them with one another. It needs enormous sets of data to find these patterns. And it's really useful. It can answer very boring analytical questions that you've always had, especially the ones you couldn't answer. And in that, it's world-changing. It can find whole new patterns in your data that you might not have expected, which we know is going to be world-changing. And it even creates new types of data because it's got the potential to analyze photos and video and audio. So suddenly we're able to find patterns that we weren't even able to see before. So it's an incredibly powerful thing. My only issue with it is that it uses data that we already have. And funnily enough, the most creative part of machine learning, because I'm not going to get all nerdy on you, don't worry, is that it's going to be about dreaming up new kinds of questions. And you don't need to be an engineer for that. It's always wonderful when you get an engineer to admit that the best people at thinking up questions for machine learning topics are non-engineers. I mean, you can't believe, or you can't imagine, but you are the imaginers. So it is an extraordinary time. But the most important part, again, is that you can't create the data. You have to have the information. And by far the biggest data set, not all the data, but by far the biggest data set we have is the internet. And at the scale of the internet, we often have sets of information to train. We need to train those. In order to get machine learning to work, you basically have to divide your data into 3 lots, so you can test, train, and validate your data. Now, you need enormous amounts of data anyway, and then you're going to cut it into 3. And if we're going to use the internet, which is huge, that's going to underrepresent groups who are outside of the normals. We already know that those we're making those normals exist through social construction. But then, having made them exist, we're going to underrepresent the smaller groups because we can't overrepresent those groups. Like, the problem with that is that if you don't consider yourself normal or aren't accepted or excluded, those marginalised people, whether that's because of colour or birthplace or religion, whatever it is, or age, that breaks the model, but no one knows because you're underrepresented in the data set. Apart from the people who are excluded, for whom it's really obvious. But as they're excluded, it's often quite hard for them, for example, disabled people, to point out or even become aware of that pattern. And I know it seems super nerdy, but like it's a really important point. So I'm going to make it more simply. Outside in the foyer is a thing called Quick Draw, which I didn't know was going to be here. So that's fab. So I gave them this a week ago. I had no idea. But it was made by a gang of friends of mine in New York, at the Creative Lab in New York. And mainly Adam and Jonas and Brenda, and then lots of other people. But, you know, and it's one of those sort of things. It really was like a few people kicking around an idea to do with AI and whether it could recognize drawings that you do, your doodles. It says draw a bicycle and you draw a bicycle. And then it tries to guess what it is, and it does that by comparing. And it gets better and better and better. The more people draw, the better idea it has of what it is that you are drawing. So bananas, for example. Machine learning can learn from all these drawings that bananas look like bananas. And actually that pretty much anything can pass as a banana. Even the curve thinks it's a banana-y bell curve. Cats. I mean, we have a lot of cats now. Like, it's not like these cats look alike or even similar. It's just that we're able to understand a lot of things, or the machines are able to understand these things as being representations of a cat. So we have a very broad notion of catness that includes all the cats, apart from some of the really, really weird ones who are excluded from catness for some reason. Shoes, more tricky. Most people draw one kind of shoe, or a few kinds of shoe. They draw those ones in the middle, the normal shoes, right? So the neural net has been able to understand an idea of what a normal shoe looks like. And that means it's begun to exclude abnormal shoes. And guess what? The most abnormal shoe is high heel. I mean, there's ones again which you're like, whatever. But, I mean, I guess that's a kind of slipper. I have no idea. I've never really spent much time thinking about it, but like, what is that? I'm more interested in the fact that that is clearly a shoe, right? But the neural net doesn't think it's a shoe entirely because we have taught it that it isn't a shoe simply through repetition, and that's called interaction bias. Human value systems rely on a more complex system of dialogue. So we're going to shift again. Rather than supply and demand to understand what is normal, social value systems are diverse and fluid, and some are inclusive and some are exclusive, and that's fine. We can't get into that. But you certainly can't hard code values like beauty or fairness, or it's not even possible for a machine to hold a subjective opinion, because either a data point is there or it isn't. And inclusion is at the forefront of this problem, because the data isn't there. Our progress relies on inclusion, not just in the workplace, not just in campaigns, but in every aspect of society. We need it to be visible. We need everyone to stand up and say, here's all the things, and it's fine. We need to create those new data points. I don't really want to be up on stage talking about how I'm trans, frankly. That's not a big deal for me. But if I'm not visible, I don't create that data point. So diversity and machine intelligence, to me, are married together and will be for a long time, because we're not doing as well on the diversity as we are on the machine intelligence. Everyone, of course, has a right to hold different values, and that's fine, to have differences, to be human. And that's okay. You're exercising your right to your own beliefs. That's absolutely fine. When we treat people differently based on those beliefs, however loosely, that's called discrimination. And we do all actively discriminate. We filter. We look for our own normal. We look for our tribe, right? That's fine too. And often we refer to that as common sense. I mean, like, frankly, there's 15-year-old grade grommets who don't want me to come and hang out with them. And that's fine. But working out what a global version of that common sense looks like is incredibly complicated and enormously problematic and very, very nuanced. And I mean, you can map the progress of human civilization in a weird way through the history of many common sense prejudices. It turns out the sun doesn't go round the earth. But we thought so for a long time because it seemed really obvious, right? It goes around the earth. Super obvious. Took us a long time to work that one out. The colour of your skin does not indicate your intelligence. Still working on that one somehow. Women should not be paid less than men. Once upon a time, well, I'd like to say that once upon a time those ideas were normal, but like in some cultures they are still normal. They were common sense. But we understand more because we have more information and it becomes clearer. When we get to like queer people and the internet, it's seriously problematic. At least in our culture. I mean, it's problematic in every culture, but like, we are not the world. Like, this room and your views are not the world. Like, your views are way outside the curve. But we're still sampling from that data set in order to teach our machines what is normal. And that leads to some really interesting problems. So, this is an initiative we're working on that started in Sydney. I've got to admit it, Tara was involved again. Maybe we should just put her name down as one of your predictions for Cannes. So the ambition of this project is to create data sets that support machine learning models, like the Perspective API, which is geeky and we won't get into. But we want them to be free from linguistic bias against marginalised communities, not just queer people, but like all of those communities. And this is really comes to the core of like that comment thing. How we police, how you moderate comments, how you moderate content within videos, how you understand whether someone is making a pro or something which is culturally acceptable within that set of values, or whether what they're saying is hate speech. Because actually, quite often the words are the same words. And I'm not really here to kind of say that we're doing this because it's just starting. I'm just here to point at the problem. I'm all about problems today. The problem is that the bell curve of our expectations differs massively from the bell curve of billions of others. And who is to say who is right? Really? I know you've got your lovely Prime Minister, but like, who is to say who is right? There is no such thing. There's no normal. And the main thing is that actually machine learning doesn't need a bell curve. It hinders it when we give it that kind of normal thing. Machine learning is really very smart. It can cope with a world full of complexities of human behaviour, all sorts of shoes, all sorts of queer, all sorts of other. It's just that we're not capable of doing that yet. I'm going to show a little video about this because I love this book.
Hi, I'm Sam and this is Kirsten, and we're part of the Project Respect team here in Sydney. We're helping to build inclusion into ML models. We believe the internet should be a place where everyone can find a space to feel included and respected. But we know that the same words that we use to describe ourselves can be turned against us and used as harassment or bullying online. This is particularly true for marginalised or underrepresented groups.
So we built Project Respect. It's a website that invites you to help teach machine learning tools to accurately spot this type of abuse, just by writing a statement about yourself and your identity.
Here's how it works. I go onto the website, I scroll down, and it asks me for 3 identity terms that I use to describe myself.
By building a data set of these terms in context, we can begin to train machine learning models to understand how different communities use different terms to talk about themselves in a positive way. Project Respect helps us to see really clearly how different models respond differently to different sentences. Lucy Wasserman from the Perspective team told us this data is awesome. So through Project Respect, we already have enough data to identify some of the problems, but we need scale to solve them, so we can train these models to remove the bias. Project Respect also allows us to respect everyone. The data gathered as part of Project Respect is available open source via the Creative Commons license. And that means that everyone can not only contribute to the project, but they can also make use of this data set.
I really want to kind of double down on the fact that Quick Draw, this, I work at Google, yeah? Everyone thinks that Google is basically just like gazillions of people working, with brilliant brains working all the time. All of these projects are like 2 or 3 people talking, identifying a problem, and doing something. All of those grassroots projects are like 2 or 3 people talking, organising, doing. This is how we are moving forward, and we are moving forward, and but that is how we're moving forward. It would be lovely to get all the CEOs in the room to get them to agree to do something, but their shareholders and their boards would probably have some issues. But we can do things because we don't have shareholders, which is handy. Apart from my mum. Must remember my mother. A lot of this is important because of how we perceive reality, like how you understand the world is very much used to be, at least on this very kind of like linear version. We now understand that we are able to see information and understand reality from many, many different perspectives. Like, it's just not that simple anymore. And this is the stuff that you've been hearing for years now. And you can begin to see information as a dimension, like time and space, and think about how we communicate. So we're moving into a really interesting period where the didactic model of a passive audience and active actor are kind of anachronistic. That's really old school. And it's very amusing watching us use technology to repeat those old models. Same thing again. We look back to the past, to how we used to do it, and then we digitize it. Ebooks are my favourite. But a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is about sound, audio, and awareness. Like, if you do look all the way back, if you think about the thing that's the most constant before the computers, we have always used sound and gesture to communicate, body language. But before language, we used sound and gesture to communicate. So to me, it's amazing that actually we're still very obsessed with this visual, sort of tiny little screen, when there are all of these other avenues for us to be exploring how we interact with information. So I tend to do theatre projects or things that remove people from the screen, from pointing their phones at things that move people into active spaces. And they're all kind of dumb little playthings. But they are all about how I would like us to be interacting in the world with information. I also have a big thing about books. Like, this is my perfect example of that looking backwards and moving forwards. Like, we took the book, which was invented 500, 600 years ago, and as a mass-producible form through Gutenberg. So it's like 16th century tech, right? Epic tech. Still works really well, best kind of tech. But when we move it into digital, we moved it in its entirety. So that you have a Kindle, which is a digital book, and you still do page 1 to 273. That's how you move through it. And that means that the writers and the creators and the entire generation of people who could be using the fact that actually that linearity, we don't need that anymore. They're not being given role models either. They're not being given ways to see the world. So, like, I love that my team put it as book covers because it's cute, but we didn't make books. We made books that were on for mobile devices, books that couldn't be printed. This is, for me, is the future of storytelling in the digital age. It's not, it's about non-linearity. It's about the way in which we all live. Like, I'm sure all of you live your lives in a constant narrative which you are not part of. It's happening in the Supreme Court, or it's happening on some sports field somewhere. But you live in this kind of non-linear world where bits and pieces of information about that come to you from different angles and you pass it all in your head. You're perfectly capable of doing it. You do it all the time. It's called reality. But when we get to narrative, we go back to these really traditional forms because that's how we've always known them. So That applies to film, it applies to everything. It applies to these books. We had one which was about memory and losing your memory, that one. We had one which was about dialogue and sort of moving between perspectives. We had one which was literally like in the world, so you had to find your way through it, which is going to be really interesting when maps changes. It says like, look for the blue door, and I'm like, what is going to happen when someone repaints that door and the Street View car goes past? Is it lost forever? And I think it's funny. The British Library are really interested, because from an archival point of view, where do we get to when books are just like our lives? Like, they change every day, the context of them changes every day, they're individual for everyone and everything. The one in the middle is a sci-fi one. Last year we did a ghost story, which sort of knows where you are, which is kind of obvious and is very clever. We did a beautiful story about which kind of unravels and unweaves. And we did a really weird-ass project called A Universe Explodes, which was owned on blockchain. So it was about science ideas of ownership, because then you can use this platform to explore other things, like the way in which digital artifacts can't be owned. You don't own your photos online. This is a whole other talk. I promise I won't do it. But we don't own those. We have a license to access them and to edit them and to download them. But you don't own them. Sorry if that's news to anyone, but you don't. They're on someone else's server. So that's about a license. That's the thing you click, accept, and continue. And so what does ownership look like? Because we can own things. And you can begin to play with those sorts of spaces where we can play with culture and philosophy and art and culture in order to explore them. So, just before I finish, one last little thing about this idea of normativity, of the very normal, and how it all applies. How does this apply to creativity and innovation and thought leadership? Apart from that thing that you can make a difference. It applies because, well, it doesn't really need much explanation. It only needs 3 words. Inclusion is not a new idea, but it's always really weird that we spend a lot of time asking people to think outside the box, and very little time hiring people who are already outside the box, for whom thinking outside the box is really, really easy, because they're already outside the box, as opposed to hiring people who are inside the box, and then asking them to think what it might be like outside the box. I'm not a designer. I'm really not. I just like articulating these problems and articulating solutions for them. And sometimes people don't get it. It's rarely great design. It never wins awards. It's very rarely perfect. But they're interesting. And for me, success is hearing the sound of brains gearing up. So I'm feeling that this has gone okay. Thank you very much.